We'd like to begin this evening. I'm Bill Barco. I'm the Executive Director of Operations for the Army War College Foundation, and we are one of the hosts this evening for the 9th annual Colonel Ron Roberge Lecture. And before we get started and Dr. Summers introduces our distinguished speaker, I'd like to introduce a few people in the audience and recognize those. And tonight for this lecture, we have Major General and Mrs. Williams. I'd like to thank you for coming this evening. And for many of you in the Carlisle area, you know Major General Mrs. Burns. I'd like to thank you again for this evening. And Ambassador Eford and her husband Neil, who are here attending. There's probably many of you in the audience, or a number of you, that have attended every one of these 9 lectures. And some of you may have even been or known or been students of Colonel Ron Roberge, but he left quite a story and testament to the point that friends of his, and many of them that were classmates of the class of 1951 at the United States Military Academy, established this lecture series and it was through their support that we're able to bring such distinguished speakers year in and year out. So as part of that, I would like also to introduce the family that is here, and his wife, Scotty, who's here in the audience, and Scotty's son, Lieutenant Colonel retired Chip Cutler, and his son, Private Casey Cutler, who is presently serving in the Ranger Battalion at Hunter Army Airfield. We also have a daughter, Miss Kim Swager, and a close friend of many years of Ron's, and this is interesting that friends every year come to this, that served with him or were with him at some time at the military academy, Colonel retired Graham Vernon. So Graham, thank you for being here this evening. Now with that introduction, I'd like to also make an announcement before Dr. Summers introduces the speaker, that next year will be the 10th Roberge Lecture. And the scheduled speaker is a classmate of Ron's, and many of you are familiar with this name, Buzz Aldrin. And some are now laughing and going, yes, I understand. Buzz has agreed to be the speaker for next year, and we look forward to hosting that again. Please, doctors.
Thank you, Colonel Barco, and we particularly thank, through you, the Army War College Foundation for its generous support of the Roberge Lecture. Colonel Roberge, when he was on the faculty here from 1975 to 1981, was a great friend of the Army Military History Institute, and we feel privileged that his name opens our Perspectives in Military History lecture series each year. And to you, Mrs. Roberge, Scotty, and the family, we're so pleased that you can be with us again tonight. Taking a nation to war, conducting and winning a war, emerging successfully from war. These are enduring challenges that strategic leaders have at the military and national level. We shall look at these ongoing challenges tonight in the historical context of the greatest generation as it fought and won the greatest war in human history, the Second World War. And we're exceptionally fortunate to have as our speaker tonight Dr. David M. Kennedy, a very productive and insightful scholar who has written on a broad range of historical topics. Just 2 years after receiving his doctorate at Yale University, His biography of Margaret Sanger was awarded the Bancroft Prize by Columbia University. In 1980, his book, Over Here, The First World War and American Society, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And that coveted honor came to him 20 years later, along with the Parkman Prize from the Society for American Historians for his book, Freedom from Fear, American Society in Depression and War, 1929 to 1945. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kennedy, the Laughlin Professor of History at Stanford University, who will speak to us tonight in the Ronald Roberge Memorial Lecture on how the United States won World War II. Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers, for that handsome introduction. And my thanks, too, to General Williams for hosting this event, to Colonel Pierce for getting me here safely tonight, this afternoon, and my special thanks to Mrs. Scotty Roberge, who I've just learned is a fellow fly fisherman. So it's a great honor for me to be here giving this lecture in honor of Colonel Ronald Roberge. Now, I'd like to begin with a personal story that you might think at first has little or nothing to do with my subject. We've actually given a fuller title to these remarks, I think, than you announced. The full title is A Tale of Three Cities, How the United States Won World War II. So just hold that thought of that title in mind for a moment. But I want to begin with a story that will seem to have very little to do with that. It's a true story. It happened to me about 5 or 6 years ago when I was doing a bicycle ride down the Big Sur, California coast. Some of you may know that area. And the ride commenced at the little town of Carmel at the south end of Monterey Bay, and it was a 100-mile ride down the coast to a little teeny town called Cambria, which is near the Hearst Castle, if those references mean anything to you. I was riding with about 100 and some people that I mostly didn't know at all. We were all milling around in the parking lot of this motel in the morning, about 7 o'clock, foggy, typical California coastal morning, and getting acquainted with each other. So you have to imagine the scene, a bunch of middle-aged guys in spandex and all those goofy things that bikers wear. And this history at Stanford. He said, "Oh, well, I know all about you guys." Well, this should have put me on my medal right at the beginning. But he said, "Oh, you historians," he said, "I know what you do. You just make up all these what-if scenarios. What if this had happened? How would history be different? What if this had not happened? How would things be different?" Well, I thought that was a pretty severely reductionist description of my life's work. But before I had a chance to formulate any kind of a response, he said, "Well, I've got one for you." He said, "What if on November 22nd, 1963, it had not been John F. Kennedy who had fallen to the assassin's bullet, but instead, on that day, it had been Nikita Khrushchev who died at the assassin's hand? How would the course of subsequent history have been different?" But as you might imagine, I had never thought that thought before, and I was caught extremely flat-footed. Before I had a chance to formulate even a syllable of a response, he said, "Well, I'll tell you." You should have seen this, should have seen it coming. He said, "I'll tell you, we can say one thing with absolute certainty about the subsequent course of history, if it had been Khrushchev and not Kennedy who had died on that day. Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev." Now, I'm very appreciative of the fact that most people in this room got the joke. This McGlynn actually did do this to me. But let me tell you something. I've tried this story out on my 19, 20-year-old students at Stanford. They just don't, they think I'm speaking in Albanian or something. They have no clue why this should be a funny topic whatsoever. So among the other implications of this is the humor is generationally specific. All right, the point of this story is that Jack McGlynn actually had a point of sorts, that historians do usually implicitly, but sometimes explicitly, ask what-if questions. We're not bench scientists. We can't replicate behaviors, natural phenomena at the laboratory bench. So as a thinking exercise, we often ask questions of this sort. What if such and such had been different? How would subsequent events be different, and so on? So here's the what if question that I want to use to frame these remarks tonight. What if the United States had lost the Second World War? How would the subsequent course of history have been different? Now that's the strongest form of the question. A slightly more responsible form of a very similar question might go something like this. What if the United States had won the war, but won it on a different timetable, with a different configuration of forces, and fighting on a different strategic doctrine, on the basis of a different strategic doctrine? How would the course of history thereafter have been different? That's the large-scale question that I hope we can all keep in mind here tonight. Now, there's a premise that underlies these remarks, and there's a proposition that I want to argue for you. The premise is that World War II, as Dr. Summers just alluded to, was an enormously transformative event in the life of this society and indeed in the life of global society. One of a handful of such events on such a scale that really leaves such a footprint on subsequent generations of history that we really have to recognize it as a major transformative event, certainly in modern history. That's the premise. The proposition that I want to argue is that the transformative effects on this society and on this society's stature and standing in the world that World War II worked were not just accidental. They're not simply incidental effects of the fact that we won the war, but they are the result of some very shrewdly taken strategic decisions to fight a particular kind of war with a particular configuration and composition of forces and on a particular timetable. And that's what gave us the result we got. Okay, so how transformative was the war? The best single-sentence summary of this matter that I've ever encountered is in a speech that Winston Churchill gave on the floor of Parliament on August 16, 1945, the day after the Japanese had signaled their intention to surrender. And Churchill gave a lengthy speech, no longer Prime Minister, but still in Parliament. And he gave a lengthy speech in which he tried to summarize for his countrymen what would be the effects going forward of this great conflict that was now concluding. And he said many, many things in this, and I won't try your patience with the recital of them all, but when I read the text of the speech, there was one thing that he said that leapt right off the page at me. He said, and he actually, among the reasons that caught my attention and stuck in my memory, is that he used a peculiar form of diction that we haven't used in this country for 150 years or so. He rendered the United States as a plural noun. And the sentence, a very simple declarative sentence, not the kind of thing that Churchill typically said, but this was a very simple sentence. He said, the United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. August 16th, 1945. The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. Now that was, without qualification, a true statement, a really true statement. And with some modifications, it's remained a true statement ever since. Now the remarkable thing about the accuracy of that statement in August of 1945 is how absolutely improbable it would have been to make such a statement or such a prediction from the vantage point of the last full peace character of the war is to remember the difference between 1940 and 1945 and how improbable was this statement that Churchill made in 1945 from the vantage point of 1940. So let's take our minds back to 1940. It was the 11th year of the Great Depression. 11th year. One Hoover administration and two Franklin Roosevelt administrations had failed to find an exit from the greatest economic calamity, hope, in modern times, at least the biggest one yet. The unemployment rate when Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933 was 25%. It was still 15% in 1940. The unemployment rate for the entire decade of the 1930s averaged 17%. It never went below 14%. This was a deeply stricken, blighted country economically, and a half generation had gone by with people thinking there never was going to be an exit from this crisis. That's in 1940. And if we look at here's one other number that helps us put that in perspective. The federal government did not keep official poverty statistics in that era. That's a product mostly of the 1960s and anti-poverty legislation. But historians have reconstructed a theoretical poverty line for 1940, and by these calculations, 45% of all white families lived below the poverty line in 1940, and 95% of all African American families. This was a country that was deeply wounded and had been for more than a decade, economically speaking. Now, if we look to the international scene and America's role in the international system in 1940, the contrast with what's coming over the horizon of the future just 5 years hence is, if anything, even more dramatic. This was a country that, in the memory of most adults in 1940, had refused to join the League of Nations, a major new multinational, international institution, even though the League was the brainchild of the American president, Woodrow Wilson. It was a country that had enacted the highest tariff barriers in its history, the notorious Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. It was a country that, for the first time in its history in 1924, had put a numerical cap, a quite low cap of 150,000 persons, on immigrant visas to the United States. Before that date, there were no numerical restrictions on immigration whatsoever. It was a country that had insisted on the repayment of the Treasury loans made to belligerent governments during World War I, Britain and France in particular. $10 billion worth. Doesn't sound like much today, but that was big money in the 1930s. And it was among the factors that distorted international capital flows badly in the entire interwar period. This was a country that the Congress of which had also, on 5 separate occasions in the 1930s, passed so-called neutrality acts, binding the hands of the executive so that Woodrow Wilson's mischief of taking the country into World War I would not be repeated. So on virtually every dimension that we look at, political, diplomatic, moral, if that's where you want to put the immigration legislation, financial, military, neutrality act, so on and so forth, on every index, this was a deeply and committedly isolationist country as of 1940. Now imagine what's coming over the horizon. Imagine you'd been walking down the streets of any great American city like Carlisle or Harrisburg or Philadelphia or wherever in 1940, and you'd heard a street corner speaker saying something like the following. My fellow citizens, I'm here in this year of grace, 1940, to tell you that this economically stricken country of ours that has failed to find a way out of this great economic catastrophe for the last decade and more is going to emerge just 5 years over the horizon of the future into a period of economic growth that will continue without interruption through the end of the century. It will double the size of our middle class as measured by the incidence of home ownership by 1960. We will create a context of national self-confidence so great that we will finally fulfill a big piece of the promise of emancipation and reconstruction and grasp the thorn that has been the biggest issue in this society for hundreds of years, which is the issue of racial equality. It will be called the Civil Rights Movement. And in fact, we will play a role in the international economy so large that we will be the locomotive that will so pull the world economy into new levels of productivity and prosperity that by the end of this century, a new word will have to be coined to describe it. That word will be globalization. Now, imagine our imaginary speaker goes on and he says, and what's more, my fellow citizens, I'm here to tell you that this isolationist country of ours, which in the last decade has passed 5 neutrality statutes, which has enacted these trade-stifling tariff barriers in the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which insisted on the repatriation of all that World War I debt, which capped immigration in 1924 at 150,000, and which refused to join the League of Nations. This country of ours is going to step forward as the founder and chief funder of a new legacy body that will take over from the League. It'll be called the United Nations. And what's more, its headquarters will be on our soil in New York City. No more of this striped pants Geneva stuff. And we will also invent new institutions. One of them will be called the World Bank. Another one will be called the International Monetary Fund. And these institutions and a number of others, one will be called the Marshall Plan, will so invigorate the world economy that we will get to this point where we have to invent this word globalization to describe the effects. Now, anybody who stood up on a street corner in the United States in 1940 and made those kinds of predictions would have been instantly identified as certifiably lunatic and dragged off someplace not to be heard from again. And yet we know, because we have the great advantage of seeing things illuminated by that fabled stern lantern of history, that those apparently lunatic predictions are exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. What's the difference between 1940 and 1945? It's World War II. And this is the mechanism that affected or facilitated those kinds of changes that I've just been talking about. Now, my students at Stanford, sometimes if they let their hair down with me and tell me what they honestly think about the study of history, they've been heard to complain that the trouble with the study of history is that it's just one damn thing after another. And if there's one particular point that I'd like you to take away from this presentation, it is with respect to the transformative effects of World War II. This is not a story about one damn thing after another, but it's a story of the quite measurable effects of some very particular strategic decisions about how to fight a war in a particular way. Now, I brought this up here virtually to the moment of American entry into the war in December 1941. Let me remind you of a relevant fact that the war in Europe is already more than 2 years old by this time. The war in Asia, depending on when we set its start date, is probably 4 years old, beginning with the Japanese invasion of the Yangtze Valley in 1937. December 1941, the United States, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, enters the war. So again, I want to take you back to that moment and share with you some documents or excerpts from documents that come from that moment. The first comes from the mouth of Adolf Hitler when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack. And he heard the news the way virtually everybody else in the world heard the news, which was over the news wire. The Japanese had not bothered to inform him in any meaningful detail what they were about to do. A reminder of how absolutely thin and anemic and opportunistic was the Japanese-German alliance. There was virtually no joint military planning, no joint economic planning, nothing. So Hitler hears the news, and we have an ear witness to what he said at that moment. He said, "Now it is impossible for us to lose the war because we have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years, namely Japan." So that's Adolf Hitler's reflex reaction to the news of the Pearl Harbor attack. He's invigorated and exhilarated and thinks this will clinch a German victory. Now again, interestingly, just a few hundred miles away across the English Channel, another major wartime figure, Winston Churchill, heard the same news at virtually the same moment in the same way. And though we don't have an ear witness to what Churchill may or may not have said at that moment, we do have Churchill's account in his great memoir, in the volume that he wrote about World War II called The Grand Alliance, in which he tries to recapitulate, or recreate, I should say, for the reader, what was his state of mind when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack. And it's a typically Churchillian, Baroque, Rococo, florid passage, and I won't try you with quoting the whole thing, but here is the relevant sentence or two. He said, "So, the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. England would live. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." Now again, from an historian's point of view, what is arresting about seeing these two documents next to each other, or to summoning them into each other's company, is here you have two leaders locked in mortal combat for the fate of Europe and the world, both of them deeply invested in making the right calculation about what American belligerency would mean, and coming to 180-degree different conclusions about what would be the implications of America's entry into the war. Now, we happen to know that Churchill had it right and Hitler didn't. But the point, from an historian's point of view here, the point is that as late as December 1941, it was not clear, even to players as major as Churchill and Hitler, exactly what kind of war the United States was going to fight, where it would deploy its forces, when, in what quantities, in what configuration of forces, and so on. As late as December 1941, that's not clear. All right, now two other remarks. The next one comes from the pen of Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, who, after Hitler rather gratuitously declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941, Ribbentrop prepared a lengthy memorandum for the Fuhrer in which he tried to think through and spell out as best he could what would now be the changes in the strategic equation now the United States was formally a belligerent. And again, it's a very detailed, lengthy, very thoughtful document. But here's the operational piece of it. This is Ribbentrop to Hitler, mid-December 1941. He said, "We have just 1 year to cut Russia off from her military supplies. If we don't succeed, and the munitions potential of the Russians joins up with, the munitions potential of the United States joins up with the manpower potential of the Russians, the war will enter a phase in which we shall only be able to win it with difficulty." Now that, it turns out, again, we know, looking back on it, that Ribbentrop had it right. It was a much shrewder assessment of what would be the implications of American belligerency than Hitler had blurted out on the morning of December 7th. All right, the last remark, fourth and last remark, and I hear, for reasons I hope you'll find justifiable, I'm going to break the time frame of December 1941 for, I think, a responsible reason, because this remark that I'll share with you comes from the pen of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the head of the Japanese Imperial Fleet and the senior military planner of the Pearl Harbor attack and later, of course, the Midway attack. And he wrote what I'm going to share with you here in September 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, but at about the time that the U.S.-Japanese relationship was beginning to go very seriously sour. And Yamamoto, in a sense, just as Ribbentrop did after December 7th, 1941, this is more than a year earlier, Yamamoto prepared a memorandum for his civilian prime minister, a man by the name of Fumimaro Konoye, in which he tried to spell out what the future might hold strategically and militarily if, in fact, the Japanese-American relationship degenerated to the point where open warfare resulted. And here's what he said. "If I am told to fight, regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year." Note his time frame is very similar to Ribbentrop's. "But I have utterly no confidence for a second or third year. And I hope, therefore, Mr. Prime Minister, that you will endeavor to avoid a Japanese-American war." Now, again, this is an extraordinary document from the historian's point of view, or anybody's point of view. Here's the person who is eventually given the task of planning the attack that initiates the war with the United States, warning his own government a year before the event that this is be a very, very stupid and wrong thing to do, and Japan should endeavor to avoid open conflict with the United States. Now, what Ribbentrop and Yamamoto both knew was that ancient rule of warfare that I'm sure is drummed into all students in this institution, that the first rule of warfare, said Sun Tzu, is to know your enemy. Second rule of warfare is to know yourself. And what Ribbentrop and Yamamoto knew was something that Franklin Roosevelt expressed in his own very homely way in a fireside chat in December of 1940 as he prepared to introduce the Lend-Lease bill to Congress. He said, a phrase that I'm sure many of you have heard many times over and will recognize, he said, "We shall become the great arsenal of democracy." Now note what he did not say on that occasion. He didn't say we'll become the sword of democracy or even the shield of democracy. We'll become the great arsenal of democracy. And this is essentially what Yamamoto and Ribbentrop understood, that if it were given time enough to marshal its absolutely stupendous, prodigious material, economic, financial, scientific, technological resources, the United States could bring onto the battlefield and into the battle theater quantities of weaponry of such sophistication that all adversaries and combinations of adversaries would be doomed. And this is essentially the way the United States organized its strategic thinking about how to wage World War II. All right, now, I'll try to deliver now on the promise of the title of this lecture, A Tale of Three Cities. And I'm going to tell a little parable about three cities that figured in World War II. And if we understand the things that happened in these three cities, I think you'll get a little more clarity about the pattern of American geostrategic and grand strategic doctrine in World War II. And I'm doing you here a favor. This is a kind of executive summary or Cliff Note version of about a 300-page passage in the book that Dr. Summers mentioned, Freedom from Fear. This is no substitute for reading the original, but this is a kind of précis of the argument there without losing any nuance whatsoever. All right, so the three cities are They're all river cities, incidentally, which is kind of an odd fact about them. The three cities are, the first one is Rouen, on the banks of the Seine River in France. The second city is very familiar to us, Washington, D.C., on the banks of the Potomac. It's Tsaritsyn. We know it today for the river on which it's located, Volgograd. But at the time our story unfolds, of course, it was known as Stalingrad. And our story unfolds in a 6-month frame of time between August of 1942 and early February of 1943. And in that 6-month period, in these three cities, things happened that if we understand their logic, their implications, we will, I think, get a better grip on this overall pattern of how the United States won World War II, in what manner it won World War II. All right. Chapter 1, Rouen, France, August 17th, 1942. Not a date that's emblazoned into our collective memory the way December 7th, 1941 is, or 9/11, 2001, or November 22nd, 1963. But on that date, August 17, 1942, a squadron of exactly 12 B-17 bombers took off from a base in the south of England. The B-17, as many of you know, was supposed to be a self-defending airplane. It mounted different configurations, 10 or 11 .50 caliber machine guns. But in this case, taking no chances, this 12-plane squadron was accompanied by a swarm of British Spitfire fighters. They transited the English Channel, dropped their bomb load on a railroad marshalling yard in Rouen on the Seine River, just about, 500 or 600 yards away, maybe a little bit more than that, from that great Gothic cathedral that all the Impressionist painters love to go sit in front of and paint, and about 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers away from where the bloody British had burned Joan of Arc at the stake a few hundred years earlier. As these things go, it was a highly successful raid. All aircraft returned to base, no damage to aircraft, no loss of crew, all the ordnance dropped on the primary target. That's not why this is important. This is important because we see on August 17, 1942, the operationalizing of a decision that had been made about a decade earlier, that in the event of another war, God forbid, the United States would place its principal bet on a new technology that promised to revolutionize the nature of warfare itself. And the new technology was the airplane, in particular, the airplane used according to the doctrine of strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is a true innovation in the history of warfare. And it derived from the writings principally of an Italian theorist by the name of Giulio Douhet, who, despite the name, he is Italian, wrote a book called The Command of the Air in the early 1920s, which is to aerial warfare what Alfred Thayer Mahan's writings on naval warfare were to naval warfare a generation or two earlier. Douhet's premise was that a new technology had emerged, the aircraft, which made possible striking one's blow not at the enemy's force in the field, on the traditional battlefield where armies had clashed since time immemorial, but instead delivering the blow to the enemy's civilian heartland, and thereby accomplishing 2 objectives. And the 2 of them in Douhet's writings were co-equally important. One was to so demolish the enemy's industrial and economic infrastructure and capacity that he could not any longer support his army in the field. And the second was so to terrorize the enemy's civilian population that they would lose their will to fight. And the Americans, in their own strategic thinking, de-emphasized the terror aspects of this. They didn't completely cast them out, but they certainly de-emphasized them. They were quite taken with the economic dimension of strategic bombing, and they made the decision that in the event of a future war, the principal bet that they would make was to build a heavy strategic air arm based on the capacity of aircraft to deeply penetrate enemy airspace, hit the enemy homeland, industrial plant, bridges, railroads, ball bearing factories, you name it, and thereby end the war relatively quickly with minimum loss of American life. And the thinking was this was a way to leverage and take advantage of some great American assets. Huge industrial capacity to make a large fleet of these kinds of aircrafts or weapon platforms, and to take advantage of American scientific and technological know-how, which could make these kinds of weapons in quantities and of a sort that would make them very, very effective. Now, I should have mentioned a moment ago that the lead pilot on that August 17, 1942 raid against Rouen was a man by the name of Paul Tibbets, who, as many of you will instantly recognize, is the pilot of the Enola Gay, the B-29, which is the successor to the B-17, that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So in the arc of this one man's military career in World War II, Paul Tibbets' career, he opens the strategic air war against Nazi-occupied Europe when he bombs. The attack on Rouen was the first all-American raid on Nazi-occupied Europe. That's its historical importance. He initiates that. And the air war becomes the principal front on which the United States carries the battle to its German adversary for the next 2 years. This is August 1942. D-Day is almost 2 years in the future. The air war was the central war in Europe until very, very late in the game. And ironically enough, or not ironic, I suppose, but arrestingly enough, Paul Tibbets is the man who effectively ends the Pacific War with the attack on Hiroshima. So this one man's military biography in World War II kind of sums up the whole case about the centrality of the strategic air arm to overall American strategy. Okay? That's the essence of the Rouen story. It's the day when this decision made in the 1930s to build a fleet of these bombers actually gets operationalized. Now, interestingly, of all the major powers that fought in World War II, only two put the strategic air arm at the center of their force configuration: the United States and Great Britain. In this country, we've had a debate that's now gone on for half a century and more about the legitimacy of the climax of this aerial campaign that is using the atomic bombs against the two Japanese cities in August of 1945. In Britain, a similar debate has gone on. Doesn't have to do with atomic bombing. But of all the senior commanders in Britain after the war, only one was not elevated to the peerage, which is Arthur Harris, also known as Bomber Harris, who ran the British strategic bombing campaign. And this is long thought to be indicative of Britain's own bad conscience about the way it employed this particular military technology. All right. Anyway, this is chapter 1, and now let's move to chapter 2 of our story, which takes place in a much more familiar venue to us, and it's a much more prosaic chapter in this story. The setting is Washington, D.C., and the date is October 5th, 1942, just a few weeks later. And the venue is the office of a person whose name is largely lost to popular history anyway, Donald Nelson, who was the head of something called the War Production Board. And Nelson's job was to shift the economy from a civilian to a military basis, to start channeling resources from the civilian economy to the military economy, to make possible the implementation of a great elaborate planning document called the Victory Program, capital V, capital P, a document that had been composed under the direction of one Albert Wedemeyer in the War Plans Department, mostly in the summer of 1941. An incredibly detailed blueprint for how many board feet of lumber were going to have to be cut and milled to build the barracks to train the troops, and how much cotton and wool we need to clothe them, and how many rifles we're going to need, and how many tanks and trucks and jeeps and chainsaws and you name it, everything. And that program was put together, and Nelson's job was to organize the reorientation of the economy from civilian and military purposes and make possible the economic and physical objectives of the Victory Program. As 1942 had gone on, Nelson received increasingly urgent advice from his economic advisors, including particularly a man by the name of Simon Kuznets, who later won the Nobel Prize, that the rate of shifting from civilian to military purposes was too fast, and the production goals set in the Victory Program were too far out of reach, and that it was infeasible, not feasible, to reach the goals originally set. And this became known in the circles that debated this thing as the feasibility dispute. Again, an episode that's largely lost to historical memory, but is critical to understanding how the United States actually waged the war. The military, of course, wanted as much material as they could get as fast as they could get it, but the civilian leadership, especially in the person of Donald Nelson, started arguing that the distortions in the civilian economy were going to be too severe if we pursued this mobilization program at the pace and at the scales that were originally mandated. It was just not feasible, Nelson kept saying. Well, a showdown came in his office on October 5th, 1942. Henry Wallace, then the vice president, represented the White House, backed up Nelson, and the military had to settle for this because the White House is the ultimate authority, of course, that the whole mobilization program was going to be rescaled and set on a different timetable. And two very, very important implications flowed very concretely and directly out of this. One was that the target date for the event we know as D-Day, the cross-channel amphibious invasion of Northwest Europe, the target date in the victory program had originally been set for July 1, 1943. Now, we all know what happens on June 6, 1944. So effectively, one implication of this decision was to delay D-Day by a year. Okay? It's 11 months, but let's call it a year. The other implication was that the original victory program had called for mobilizing, drafting, training, equipping, transporting, deploying 215 divisions. Now the decision was made to scale that down to 90 divisions. That left 125 divisions worth of manpower originally scheduled for induction into the armed forces, left free to stay home, work the production lines. The military called this, at the time, military very uncomfortable with this. They called it the 90 division gamble. Now, why was it a gamble? All right, the answer to that question takes us to our third chapter in our third city, Stalingrad. Early February 1943, just a few months after this decision is put in process, the decision taken in Donald Nelson's office in October of 42, the Russians, of course, as everyone in this room knows, surrender at Stalingrad. The Germans surrender. General Paulus's forces are handed over. They hand themselves over to the Russians. This is the first strategic scale victory that the Soviets have managed to impose on the invading Germans. And as much as any single battle can be said to be so, Stalingrad is the pivot of World War II. It's where the Germans had committed the great overwhelming bulk of their forces. It's where the Russians now pass from the defensive to the offensive, and the war begins to take on a wholly different character. Now, there were many people in both Britain and the United States, including Churchill and Roosevelt, a lot of people around them, who had not fully foreseen this outcome of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The victory program, Wedemayer's document, written in summer of 41, had been premised on the idea that the Soviets would go down, that they would either be militarily defeated, since Hitler's blitzkrieg, the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics had knocked everybody else out that they'd ever faced, or the Russians would be so badly wounded and bleeding so badly from the continued German presence on their soil that they would seek a political exit from the war. As, remember, the first Bolshevik government had done in 1918, had negotiated a political treaty with the Kaiser's Germany and shut down the Eastern Front in the First World War. And as recently as 1939, the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets had again shown their willingness, if need be, to do political business with Hitler's Germany. And there was every reason to believe they would do it again if things got tough enough for them. The Stalingrad victory largely, well, almost completely laid to rest the worry that the Soviets would be militarily defeated in the field, and it pretty substantially laid to rest the worry that the Russians, even if they managed to stay on their feet militarily, would be so hurting that they would seek a political settlement with Hitler's Germany. Now, in a sense, in a very concrete sense, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad as the turning point in the war ratified the viability of these previous American decisions to fight primarily from the air, to commit to the invasion that we know as D-Day only very late in the game, and to mobilize a much smaller force of 90 divisions than had originally been imagined to be 215 divisions. Now, Joseph Stalin, as it happens, had his own very cynical but absolutely accurate way of describing this arrangement. He said, and he said it repeatedly to Churchill and Roosevelt, he said it to their faces when he met them at Tehran in late 1943. And this is in the record. He said, I'm quoting him now, he said, "It appears that you Americans have decided to fight this war with American money and American machines and with Russian men." As I said, it's a very cynical way of describing this situation, and we don't want to impute motive to this necessarily, but there it is. That turns out to be a fairly accurate description of what the way the war unfolded. All right, now let me just, by way of conclusion, say a few things about some of the implications of this. One has to do, going back to, if you remember the imaginary street corner speaker I was talking about and how he called attention to the fact that this country was deeply impoverished in 1940, but it was going to transform. So where I want to take us back to now is a consideration of what the civilian economy looked like during World War II in this country and what stage it set for the post-war period. I do believe, in fact, that one of the sources of his anxiety about the unfeasibility of the program he was originally directed to implement was his fear that if the war began to pinch and cramp the civilian economy too badly, that the American public, which had so recently been so decidedly isolationist, might revert to those isolationist habits and lose their will to prosecute the war. I just believe that, reading between the lines in the record, he never actually said that. All right, but let's just look at the American civilian economy. Of all the nations that fought World War II, every single one of them, there's only one that managed to grow its civilian economy while waging the war, and that's the United States. We take our two partners in the Grand Alliance, the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. In both of those countries, over the course of the war, the civilian sector of the economy shrank in both countries by about a third. Civilians on the home front had, not to mention bombing and invasion and so on, but just the supply of things that they had, clothing, fuel, shelter, food, so on. Just the normal staples of a civilian economy. That supply of stuff shrank by about a third. In the United States, and the United States alone, of all the countries that fought the war, the civilian economy expanded even while waging this enormous global conflict. No other country in World War II could make that claim, and indeed very few countries in the history of warfare could make the claim. They could fight a 3 or 4 year protracted war of attrition, which essentially is what World War II is, and at the same time grow their civilian economies. Unprecedented achievement. Now there's a story that illustrates this that I'm very fond of. There used to be a columnist for a little newspaper called it was called the Carolina Israelite. The writer was Harry Golden. He had a column called Only in America. Some of you remember it maybe? I don't think I've got the title quite right, but the column was called Only in America. And this is an Only in America story. I didn't get it from Harry Golden, but I think he would have liked it. And it's a twofer. It's a compound Only in America story, okay? One part of which is a little bit frivolous, the other part of which makes our point. It has to do with Macy's department store, which was then, if not the biggest retailer in the United States, certainly one of the biggest. And at the end of toward the end of 1944, the marketing geniuses at the Macy's department store decided they started casting around for a date on which they could organize a store-wide sale. And this is the first and more frivolous part of the Only in America dimension of this story. The date they settled on was December 7th, 1944, the third anniversary of one of the greatest humiliations to American arms ever. Just a week or two or so before the Battle of the Bulge, and not far distant from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In other words, the moment when American forces in both the Pacific and European theaters are maximally engaged, the height of the war from America's point of view. But that's the date they've picked. It would be as if Walmart or whatever organized a sale today commemorating 9/11. I mean, we would find that a little bit gauche, don't you think? But just a little cheeseoid. But that's what they did. Okay. All right. The more significant part of this story, and again, this is the more important Only in America part of the story, is that Macy's went ahead and had this sale on December 7th, 1944. And when they finished the sale at the end of the day and totaled up all the register receipts and so on, they found that they had racked up the highest dollar volume of sales of any year, in any day in the history of Macy's. There is no other country that fought World War II where that scene could have happened. And it's a reminder, if we needed yet another one, that America's World War II was not like anybody else's. We fought a different kind of war. And it was during the war that we fired up these engines of economic growth and income prosperity and so on that propelled that post-war era of growth of which we've been the beneficiaries until this week. All right. All right, one last matter. I'm going to go back to my crib sheet here because I'm going to recite some large numbers, and I don't want to get them wrong. But this is another implication of the fact that we fought the war on this timetable on the basis of these strategic doctrines with the particular composition of forces that we did. And it has to do with the casualty counts in the various belligerent countries. I'm just going to give you some numbers of the dead by country in World War II, and they tell a story. They're grisly numbers to hear, but they tell a story. We take our first ally in the Grand Alliance, the United Kingdom, country at that time in the neighborhood of 1/4 to 1/3 our population size. The total number of dead in the United Kingdom was 350,000 in World War II, of which about 100,000 were civilians. China, a country we sometimes forget was in the war at all. We lost sight of it in a way. 10 million dead in the war, beginning in 1937 in this case, and we estimate that of the 10 million Chinese dead, about 6 million were civilians. Yugoslavia, relatively small, easy to forget country by American standards. 2 million dead in the war, of whom 1.5 million were civilians. Poland, 8 million dead, of whom 6 million were civilians, and most of those civilians Jews. Japan, one of our adversaries, 3 million dead in the war, 1 million of them civilians. The great majority of Japanese civilians, about 800,000 of them, killed not in the two atomic attacks, but in the firebomb raids that began in November of 1944. Germany, our other major adversary, 6.5 million dead, of whom 1 million were civilians. Most German civilians killed in the combined Anglo-American bombing attacks. Soviet Union, 24 million dead, of whom 16 million were civilians. And then finally, the United States, 405,399 military dead in all branches of service, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine, which is eventually classified as a combat arm for purposes of these numbers. 405,399, a number I don't intend to belittle at all. We owe them a great debt of gratitude for the world we live in, but I think the point makes itself. If you put that number in the scales with the other numbers I've just recited, you see some of the logic of what Joseph Stalin said. And if we look to the civilian side of the ledger in World War II, remember of the numbers I just recited to you, World War II is the first war, I believe, in all of human history where civilian deaths exceeded military deaths due to deprivation and loss, and not least of all, strategic bombing campaigns. If we looked at the civilian side of the ledger, in the case of the United States in World War II, and asked what was the civilian death toll in the 48 contiguous continental states, the states that had a star on the flag as of the 1940s, the number of dead due to enemy action in World War II in the 48 continental states is exactly 6 people. 6, one-digit number. They all died together, and they died at the same moment, and in a very unlikely place. On the slopes of a mountain called Gearhart Mountain. It's more of a ridge than a mountain, outside the town of Bly, Oregon. And for those of you here in Pennsylvania that don't have a mental map of Oregon in your mind, it's right near Klamath Falls. That helps any. It's in south central Oregon. It's a little dinky, out-of-the-way hamlet that literally, if you're driving through there, you blink and you miss it. The dead were a woman by the name of Elsie Mitchell. She was 25 years old. And 5 children who were with her. And Elsie Mitchell was the wife of a minister in a local church. His name was Archie Mitchell. And Archie and Elsie Mitchell had taken these 5 children from their church on a Sunday school outing. And the Reverend Mitchell had left them off, deposited them from the vehicle in which he'd brought them up on the Gerhardt Mountain. And he was parking the car when he heard an explosion. And he ran toward the noise, and he found his wife and the children all laid out like the spokes of a wheel, already dead, on the ground. Turned out what had happened, apparently, was that they had seen this strange-looking object in the brush. It's a very wooded area. And they apparently started pulling at it to get it out and have a better look, and it blew up and killed them all instantaneously. And what they had found was a Japanese firebomb. The Japanese launched about 10,000 of these things from a place called 99 League Beach near Tokyo. They were an extremely primitive device. They're made up of these 30-foot diameter balloons, the panels for which were made out of mulberry paper, and pasted together on the floors of school cafeterias and gymnasiums in Japan, because they needed a big floor space to do this, and that's the places they found. They composed the balloons or pasted the panels together, brought them to 99 League Beach, filled them with, I believe, helium, and then slung a little gondola under them, and the gondola had about a 3-pound incendiary bomb. And there was a little bit of technology in this. There was an altimeter and some sandbags and a mechanism to drop sandbags or to let gas out of the balloon in order to keep the balloon in a certain altitude envelope so it would stay in the jet stream. The Japanese meteorologists had discovered the jet stream before anybody else. And the idea was they had no internal means of propulsion whatsoever. They're an extremely crude device. The idea was to loft these things into the jet stream. They would transit the Pacific, and they would finally fall to Earth in North America. The incendiary device would go off, and it would ignite big forest fires on such a scale that the Americans would be compelled to direct significant resources toward extinguishing the forest fires and thus be slowed down in their advance toward the Japanese home islands. Now, it was an almost pathetically crude scheme, but it was, in concept, a form of strategic bombing. It comes right out of Julio Douay's book, although instead of having multi-engine B-29 4,500-mile combat radius aircraft to deliver these weapons, they had these no internal propulsion balloons. But it was Japan's own form of strategic bombing against the United States. It didn't work worth a darn, and in fact, the very few forest fires that were ignited were rather easily extinguished, and most of these things became duds. One killed Mrs. Mitchell and those 5 children. Now, I want to close by conjuring a scene in our collective mind's eye that I can't prove existed, but I think it's a historically responsible conjecture to think that such a thing could have happened. Imagine you were a crew member on one of those B-29s that took off from the Mariana Islands every night in the first 8 months. Actually, the firebombing raids went on even after the dropping of the first atomic bomb. Every night actually it's more than that, it's from November 44 through August 45. By the time these things were in full cry in the spring of 45, there were nightly bomber streams of 500, 600, 700 aircraft headed to Japan every night to drop these very scientifically constructed patterns of high explosive and incendiary bombs with the hope of creating firestorms. And they did once in Tokyo on March 9th, 10th, 1945. That night, the American bomber fleet successfully ignited a firestorm in Tokyo that killed 110,000 people in one night. That's more than died at Nagasaki. So imagine you're a crew member on one of these aircraft, and you're headed off from the Marianas up toward Japan, and you looked out your gun turret or bombardier's turret, whatever you were in, and you saw one of these Japanese balloons headed the other way. They quite imaginably could have crossed vectors out there in the middle of the Pacific. It's not unimaginable at all that some crew member might have seen one of these things, and you wondered what that was. And if you were fully informed, of course, you'd eventually figure out that that was Japan's retaliation attack on the United States, on the strategic bombing doctrine, inflicting its blow on the American heartland, not on the American forces in the field. And in that scene, if we can imagine it, you have Admiral Yamamoto's nightmare realized. That given time enough, time the Russians essentially bought, the United States could bring to bear new technologies, such as the B-29 bomber and eventually the atomic bombs themselves, on such a scale that Japan, and Germany too, would be doomed. And in that scene, I think you see exactly encapsulated what Yamamoto had feared as early as 1940. And that's why Churchill had it right when he said in 1945 that at that moment, the United States stood at the summit of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy. And now we'll have opportunity for questions. As you ask your questions, please use the microphones in front of your seat so that your questions as well as your answers can be preserved on the film that we're making of this presentation tonight. Who would like to ask the first question?
Did the 90 divisions include, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Did the 90 divisions include Marine Corps divisions? And if not, how many of them were activated?
That's a known number, and I think I know it, but I'm hesitating just a bit. I know I'm in a room full of experts. I believe that there were 8 Marine divisions in World War II, but I'm not absolutely 100% confident in that number. And no, the 90 divisions does not include the Marines. That's Army. But think of the implications of it. I mean, the Germans had something in the order with their allies of 300 divisions on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front shut down, and they transferred even a fraction of that manpower to the English Channel. The event we know as D-Day would have been, to put it mildly, a lot more difficult to pull off. Yes, sir.
Dr. Kennedy, I would like to ask a question. What if the 200 or so divisions that were originally planned had been sent to fight World War II? Would, that have ended World War II much quicker or in a much slower way?
Well, it's an excellent question. And here we get into the land of what-ifs again, because according to the way Donald Nelson and his economic staff analyzed the matter, we could not easily have deployed, or really fully mobilized and deployed, that 215 division total without serious distortion to the civilian economy. So among the things that Simon Kuznets and others argued to Nelson was that regardless of whether the number of divisions mobilized stayed at 215 or went to 90, the target date of July 1, 1943 for D-Day was just not going to be realized. So what you have to imagine is a scenario where D-Day takes place on something other than the original schedule. We have to manufacture now enormously greater quantities of landing craft and transports and all the stuff that you needed to get across the channel. And that meant depriving the civilian economy of a lot of the stuff that it was otherwise using. So when you start concatenating these various what-ifs, you really get to the point of diminishing returns. It's very hard to say with any precision how things would have looked differently otherwise. This is, as I say, a thought experiment to kind of help us understand what are the major features of the strategic doctrines on which the war was fought. Yeah.
I have a related question. As we know, by the Battle of the Bulge, let's say, we were having trouble filling up the divisions we had, especially when it came to infantrymen. So can you tell us any more about the decision process that led to the scaling back of the initial victory plan from 215 to 90? And did it include some anticipation of the difficulties that would have been engaged in fielding such a large force?
Well, good. There was a lot of I told you so kind of commentary at the time of the Bulge for exactly this reason, that we'd undermanned the overall force, and now the chickens were coming home to roost. But the decision-making, I took a little poetic license in the presentation I made when I crunched it all into October 5th. In fact, the wheels are put in motion on that date, October 5th, 1942, in the direction of getting to the 90 division configuration. But actually that debate rolled on quite a bit longer, and among the things that finally clinched it was the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. Because then it became obvious that the Soviets were going to stay in the war for the foreseeable future, and that they would, over time, either pin down or drain German resources on the Eastern Front, that the so-called Second Front in Northwest Europe, the cross-channel invasion, would be a manageable affair with a smaller ground force. You know, I might say in front of, when I've talked about this subject with audiences less knowledgeable and sophisticated than this one, and when I announced that I'm going to tell a little parable of 3 cities, more than once some smart guy in the crowd has volunteered that he knows what the 3 cities are, or people start guessing. And the best guess I ever heard in this connection was that the 3 cities that, if we know their story, we understand the core of American strategic doctrine in World War II, were Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, which of course are the 3 sites of the atomic bomb project. Well, if you think about it, that doesn't really help us understand the European war very well, but okay. But in a sense, you could tell the same story you could make the same point by organizing the story around those 3 cities, in this sense. By, let's say, 1939, the entire world scientific community understood the implications of the breakthroughs in nuclear research that have been going on at a very rapid pace over the decade of the 1930s. And everyone understood that there was potentially a weaponizable piece of science that was materializing here. And in fact, the famous letter that Albert Einstein writes, actually he didn't write it, he signed it, but it was written by Edward Teller and a couple of other people. It was presented to Franklin Roosevelt, signed in August of '39, and presented to Roosevelt a couple of months later. Einstein in that letter speculates about an atomic weapon, but he thinks it will have to be so big that it could only be transported in a ship. So he thinks it will not be very usable for military purposes, because you couldn't sail a cargo vessel into Tokyo Bay and explode the thing. So there's a lot of, my point is simply that the world scientific community knew this, that this was at least potentially possible. And every major belligerent had a nuclear weapons program. The Russians had a little one, the British had a big one, which they merged with ours. The Japanese had a little one. And the Germans had a fairly big one. And indeed, the Einstein letter, if you ever read the text of it, is motivated. Its point of departure is the recognition in 1939 that the Germans are now embargoing the shipment of uranium from the Joachimsthal mines in what used to be Czechoslovakia after they'd taken it over. This was a clear signal to Einstein and other scientists that they had embarked on an atomic weapons program. Okay? All right, now, time goes on, and the United States eventually goes into high gear in its own Manhattan Project, only in the early months of 1942. Up until that time, the premise had been that, yeah, there might be something weaponizable out there in the future at some point, but the quantity of fissile material you need to produce an explosion is so large that there's no feasible delivery system. You have to deliver it by ship, and that's not going to work. In early 1942, some British scientists figure out that you might need as little as 12 kilos to make an explosive device, and that opens the whole avenue of research, and that's when the Manhattan Project really takes off. Okay, the point of this recital is that at almost the same moment, within a few weeks of each other, the Americans decide to go ahead with the Manhattan Project and appropriate this huge amount of money to do it. And at almost the same time, the Germans, with whom we think we're in a race to get this thing first, essentially shut down their project. They don't quite shut it down entirely, but they push it way off to the back burner. And the German munitions minister, the counterpart of Donald Nelson, the guy who was given the job for mobilizing the German economy and shifting it to military production purposes, in early 42, and he realized that now it was going to be a long war of attrition. Blitzkrieg was not going to fulfill its promise of a very quick end to the war. Every adversary that they met, that the Russians were holding on. Germany had to knuckle down now for a lot longer, protracted struggle of attrition. So Speer's job is now to prepare the German economy for that prospect. And among the first things he did was he went to the German scientists, nuclear physicists, especially Werner Heisenberg, the author of the famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And in effect, he asked them, well, boys, how long will it take you to get us a weapon? And they say, in effect, well, maybe in 2 to 3 years' time, we'll have something usable, But to get there, we're going to need, and they gave them this list, of 50% of all the copper that you can mine in the Reich, 85% of all the scientists and engineers that we can find in the Reich, 20% of all the Reich's electrical generating capacity, and so on, so on, and so forth. And Speer said, that's fine, but we cannot afford it. What he says in his memoir, he said, we would lose our capacity to wage conventional war if we directed so many resources to this gamble that maybe we'll get an atomic weapon. So they just can't do it. Now, there's a story in there. It's the same story I was trying to tell earlier, that of all the countries that fought the war, the United States had unimaginably larger margins of finance and scientific knowledge and technological knowledge and raw materials and a combination of adversaries. That's what Ribbentrop and Yamamoto knew, and you could arrive at the same conclusion about what distinguished the American war effort from everybody else's. What was the unique asset that the Americans brought to this struggle? You could tell that, or reach that same conclusion by examining the various belligerents' pathways to or toward an atomic weapon. The United States was the only, it didn't have exclusive knowledge. It had the capacity, the industrial, infrastructural, and technological capacity to do this. That's what differentiated it from everybody else. Okay, maybe one last question?
Yes, sir. I'd like to.
We can do two, I'm sure.
Yes, sir. I'm presently a student in this year's class at the War College. One of the issues. What do you, or have you seen the moral implications of what we understood and applied as a nation during the Second World War that allowed us to justify the civilian deaths?
Well, as you, I'm sure everyone can appreciate, this is a deeply troubled and sensitive subject, so I want to treat it with all the respect that it's due. I said earlier that the Americans, when they read Douay's book, The Command of the Air, they emphasized the economic rather than the psychological dimension of it. And for most of the period of the air war in Europe, the American bombing program was guided by those principles, and there was a reasonably sincere, genuine, and effective effort to combine bombing to high-value military and economic targets and not simply to terrorize the public. The British did it differently. They bombed at night, what they euphemistically called area bombing. They just let her rip over these big urban conurbations, and terror was the principal purpose of what they were doing. In fact, Conrad Crane, who teaches here, has written a wonderful book about this. You might want to read it if you haven't already. However, even in the late stages of the European War, in February of 1945, when a lot of people thought the Germans were on their very last few breaths of capacity to keep going, Dwight Eisenhower authorized a terror raid. It had no other logic. It was just to demoralize the civilian population of Berlin on the night of February 10th, 1945, killed 25,000 people on the ground, didn't do the job. The Germans kept going for another 3 months. But he crossed the threshold there and began to embrace the terror dimensions of strategic bombing. Now, the Pacific Theater, it's a different, and I'm afraid a much more troubling story because there were very, very few qualms about attacking civilian targets in Japan. In fact, I learned this in Conrad Crane's book, as a matter of fact, the first commander of, in the Marianas of the air arm that was attacking Japan asked to be relieved of his command because he just found this so morally troubling. And the guy that took over for him was Curtis LeMay, who had no such qualms. Now, as you can appreciate, my students especially, younger people especially, are to this day very agitated about this. They think this is an issue in our national past, in our collective history that needs to be addressed and understood. What I tell them is that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not the issue. That is a misplaced locus for this debate. The real debate ought to be about the antecedent decision, months earlier, to legitimate the targeting of civilians as a legitimate way of waging war. two atomic bombs are just another technological means to that end. The real moral point where the rubber meets the road, where you really have to think hard about the legitimacy of it, is not just the atomic weapons. As I say, that's just another more advanced technology. It's the legitimating of warfare against civilians. I don't know how many of you might have seen the film The Fog of War. Of course. But I learned from that film something I hadn't known before about McNamara, that he was on LeMay's staff out there in the Marianas during the last months of World War II, and his job was to be part of a team that put together tried to mathematically figure out the optimal combinations of incendiary and high explosive ordnance and altitudes from which to make the drop and patterns of crisscrossing the bombing runs and so on, in order to get the maximum destructive effect. And you may remember in that film, McNamara tells, to me, was just a bone-chilling story about how LeMay said to him one night, he said, "You know, McNamara, if we lose this war, you and I will be tried as war criminals." And McNamara leans into the camera, in my memory of it, at least in that film, and he says, and he was right. He said there was nothing in the rules of warfare that justified what we were doing. So there it is. Okay, last one.
Sir, as Colonel Jim Bowling, I'm the faculty here at the War College. To date, I mean, your remarks this evening might lead one to the conclusion that you believe that the United States' victory in the Second World War was due to outproducing our adversaries. I'm wondering if you could comment on whether or not it was outproducing, or did we outfight and outthink them?
Well, outfight is a term that I'm not going to try to quantify. Outthink, I would certainly allow that one, in the sense that we put together, let me put it in economist language, okay? That the Roosevelt administration, or Roosevelt and Marshall and Eisenhower, the whole crowd of war planners and so on, that they found what an economist might call the least cost pathway to victory. That they understood the unique assets the United States could bring to bear, took maximum optimal advantage of them, and won their way through to victory with the least damage to the American civilian economy, not least of all because of geography, because it was very difficult for an adversary to get here. But that's, in a sense, a kind of incidental matter. They found the least cost pathway in terms of damage to the civilian economy, loss of American life. And if that's outthinking the enemy, and I think it is, they did a very good job of it. So I don't mean to be critical of it. I'm simply saying we need to face the facts, and in a sense, I suppose, at the end of the day, we should be grateful they did it that way, rather than some more costly way.
And outthinking and rethinking, you've certainly given us a rich digest to consider, and we thank you very much. And now we have some presentations. Colonel Barco, please.
Dr. Kennedy, on behalf of the Army War College Foundation, I want to present you this pewter plate. There's a tradition within the Army War College, and I hope you enjoy it and put it in a place that'll be recognized.
I shall indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.